The accident. It was past midnight when Sandra's phone rang loudly on her bedside table. Her heart skipped as she saw the name flashing on the screen. It was Keanu's manager. His voice trembled as he said something that made her sit straight. Keanu had been found badly injured on a quiet road outside Los Angeles. Sandra's hands shook as she grabbed her car keys and rushed out. The city lights blurred past as she drove through the cold night. She remembered their last conversation that evening. Keanu had said he was going for a ride to clear his mind. He had sounded calm, maybe too calm. At the hospital, Sandra saw him lying still, covered in bruises and blood. The machines beeped softly beside him. Doctor said it was a motorcycle accident. He had tried to avoid hitting a stray dog and crashed into a fence. His leg was fractured and his ribs were broken. Yet somehow, he had dragged himself off the road before collapsing. Sandra felt tears burn her eyes as she sat beside his bed. She held his cold hand gently. He looked peaceful, almost unaware of the storm around him. The nurse whispered that Keanu had murmured her name before losing consciousness. Something inside her broke when she heard that. Days passed, but Keanu didn't wake up. Sandra visited every morning and stayed until night. She read books to him, played his favorite songs, and talked about old memories from their speed days. The doctor said he could hear her voice even if he couldn't respond. She hoped that was true. One evening, a stranger walked into the room. He was a tall man in his 50s with a small envelope in his hand. He introduced himself as a paramedic who had found Keanu. He told Sandra something strange. When they reached Keanu that night, he had been holding a letter tightly in his hand. It was addressed to her. Sandra opened it slowly. Inside, in Keanu's neat handwriting, were only a few words. "If you are reading this, I just want to say thank you. You made me believe in peace again." She froze, staring at the letter, feeling her throat tighten. Why had he written that before the accident? That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. She replayed every moment from the last few weeks. Keanu had been quiet lately, distant, almost like he was carrying something heavy inside. She remembered how he would stare at the sunset and say, "Life gives second chances only to those who forgive themselves." As days turned into weeks, his condition improved slightly, but he still hadn't woken up. Sandra began to notice strange things. One nurse mentioned that Keanu had refused to call anyone before leaving home that night. Another said his phone was found switched off near the crash site. It felt like he didn't want to be found at all. One evening, Sandra saw a faint movement in his fingers. Her eyes widened. She leaned closer and whispered, "Keanu, it's me. You're safe now." His lips moved slightly, and a weak sound came out. "Why, did you come?" he said softly, barely audible. Sandra's tears rolled down her face as she smiled and whispered, "Because you would have done the same." She held his hand as the monitors beeped faster, showing life returning to his body. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. But deep inside, she knew this was not just an accident. Something about that letter, that night, and his strange calmness felt like the beginning of a bigger truth. The hidden letter. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window as Sandra sat quietly beside Keanu's bed. His breathing was steady now, and there was a calm rhythm in the room. Doctors said he was out of danger, but his body was still weak. Sandra smiled faintly when his eyes flickered open for a few seconds, only to close again. It was progress, but her heart still carried questions. She looked again at the letter he had written. Those few words, "You made me believe in peace again," kept echoing in her mind. She felt there was more behind them, something unsaid. Keanu was not the kind of man to write emotional letters without reason. He was quiet, thoughtful, and often hid his pain behind gentle smiles. Later that day, a nurse handed Sandra a small box that had been found with Keanu's jacket. Inside it were his broken sunglasses, his motorcycle key, and a folded photo. Sandra opened it carefully. The photo showed Keanu sitting on a park bench with a small boy beside him, smiling. She had never seen this picture before. On the back, there was a date and a name. Ethan, May 23rd. Her chest tightened. She didn't know who Ethan was, but she could sense that this boy meant something important. She decided not to ask anyone yet. Instead, she kept the photo in her bag and went back to Keanu's room. By evening, Keanu opened his eyes again, slowly this time. Sandra's heart raced. She called the nurse, but he weakly shook his head, signaling her to stay. "Hey," she whispered. You're awake. He smiled faintly, his voice low and tired. You shouldn't have come? Sandra frowned. Why would you say that? He turned his head away. Because I didn't want anyone to see me like this. Sandra held his hand gently. You don't have to hide from me. I'm here because I care. He stared at her for a long time and then said softly, There's something I need to tell you, but not here. Not yet. Before she could ask more, his eyes closed again. The nurse said he needed rest, but Sandra's mind was spinning. What was he hiding? And who was Ethan? The next morning, Keanu's manager visited the hospital. He thanked Sandra for staying and handed her a small envelope. This came from Keanu's lawyer, he said. Inside was a short note written by Keanu weeks before the accident. It said, If anything ever happens to me, please make sure she gets the truth. Below it was a single line. Find Ethan at Rose Hill Orphanage. Sandra felt her hands grow cold. An orphanage? Was this boy connected to Keanu's past? She decided she couldn't wait. She left the hospital quietly that afternoon, promising to return before sunset. She drove across the city, following the address written on the paper. Rose Hill Orphanage was small, peaceful, surrounded by tall trees and soft laughter of children playing. An elderly woman greeted her kindly. When Sandra asked about Ethan, the woman's smile faded. Ethan was special, she said softly. He used to talk about a man who visited him every month. He said the man told him stories about courage, kindness, and forgiveness. He called him his guardian. Sandra's eyes widened. That man, was it Keanu Reeves? The woman nodded slowly. Yes, but Ethan left us 2 months ago. He was adopted by a family in another city. Before leaving, he gave us a letter. He said it was meant for the man who saved his life. The woman handed Sandra the letter. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. It read, Dear Keanu, you taught me that being broken is not the end. You gave me hope. One day I will tell the world what you did for me. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what Keanu had done, but she understood one thing. His accident was not random. It was tied to something deeper, something that started long before that night on the road. As she drove back to the hospital, her mind was full of questions. When she entered his room, Keanu was awake, his eyes calm but distant. She sat beside him and placed the letter on his table. I went to Rose Hill, she said softly. I met them. I saw Ethan's letter. Keanu's face went pale. His lips trembled slightly and he whispered, You shouldn't have done that. Sandra looked at him, her voice shaking. What are you hiding from me, Keanu? He turned his head slowly, his eyes filled with quiet pain. Something I thought I had buried forever. The secret truth, the rain poured heavily that night as Sandra sat beside Keanu's hospital bed. His words kept echoing in her mind. Something I thought I had buried forever. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the pain he tried to hide behind his silence. She didn't press him that night, but she knew sooner or later the truth would have to come out. By morning, the storm outside had calmed, but inside her heart, a new one had begun. Keanu was staring out the window when she walked in. The light from the rising sun touched his face, making his eyes look tired yet peaceful. She placed a cup of coffee beside him and said softly, I'm not here to judge, Keanu, but I need to understand. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he began to speak. 3 years ago, before I started working on that movie in Toronto, I took a small break. I wanted to disappear for a while, to live quietly without cameras or noise. I stayed near a small town by the sea. His voice grew heavy. One night I saw a car crash near the bridge. It was on fire. I ran towards it. Inside there was a man and a boy. The man didn't make it, but I pulled the boy out just before the explosion. Sandra felt a chill. That boy was Ethan? Keanu nodded slowly. He was unconscious when the ambulance came. I stayed until they took him away. I didn't even tell them who I was. A week later, I found out his mother had passed away years before, and he had no relatives. So I started visiting him quietly at the orphanage. His voice broke slightly. He never knew who I really was until one day he saw a movie of mine on TV. He just smiled and said, My guardian is a superhero too. After that, he started calling me his family. He said I gave him a reason to live again. Sandra felt tears forming. She finally understood why Keanu had written that letter, why he looked so broken before the accident. "You blamed yourself for that night," she whispered. "You think you didn't save them both." Keanu looked away, his jaw tight. The man in that car was the boy's father. He was drunk. I could have pulled him out too, but I froze for a second. By the time I tried again, it was too late. Silence filled the room. The machines around him beeped softly like distant echoes of his guilt. Sandra reached out and placed her hand over his. "You risked your life to save someone. That's not failure, Keanu. That's humanity." For the first time, she saw tears roll down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. "Ethan was the reason I started to believe again," he said quietly. "But when he was adopted, I felt like a part of me was gone. I wrote that letter the night before my accident because I was going to visit him one last time." Sandra's heart sank. "You mean the night you crashed?" He nodded weakly. "Yes, I never made it there, but now you did. Maybe it was meant to happen that way." The door opened slightly and the nurse stepped in with a surprised look. "Mr. Reeves, there's a visitor asking for you. He says his name is Ethan." Sandra and Keanu froze. Keanu's eyes widened as if he hadn't heard right. "Ethan?" The nurse nodded. "He said he came all the way from Portland." Sandra's heart raced. She stood up quickly as a small figure entered the room. A boy around 10 years old, with bright brown eyes and a shy smile, walked slowly toward the bed. "Hi," he said softly. "You don't remember me, do you?" Keanu tried to sit up, his hands trembling. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking. The boy held a small paper plane in his hand. "You used to make these for me," he said with a smile. "You told me that when life breaks us, we can still fly again." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. Keanu reached out his hand and Ethan placed the paper plane in his palm. "How did you find me?" Keanu asked softly. Ethan looked down. "I saw the news. They said you were hurt. I told my new parents I had to come." Sandra placed her hand over her heart, overwhelmed by the sight. Keanu pulled Ethan gently closer, his eyes shining with gratitude and sorrow. But before they could say more, Keanu suddenly winced in pain. The monitors started beeping fast. The nurse rushed in, and Sandra stepped back, panic filling her eyes. Doctors surrounded the bed, shouting instructions. Ethan stood frozen, his paper plane falling to the floor. Sandra whispered his name through tears. "Keanu." The nurse pushed her gently aside as the lights flickered above them. The peaceful room that had once held quiet hope now filled with chaos and fear. Sandra held Ethan close, her heart pounding. Between life and light, the sound of machines echoed through the cold hospital room. Sandra stood frozen, her breath trembling as doctors surrounded Keanu's bed. Alarms flashed red, nurses rushed with tubes and injections, and the world outside seemed to fade. Ethan clutched her hand tightly, his small fingers shaking. The doctor shouted, "His heart rate is dropping, we're losing him!" Sandra felt her chest tighten. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "Please, not like this." She looked down at Ethan, whose eyes were filled with fear. "Is he going to die?" he asked softly. Sandra knelt, holding him close. "No, he's stronger than that. He'll fight." For what felt like endless minutes, chaos ruled the room. Then, slowly, the beeping of the heart monitor began to steady. The doctor sighed in relief. "He's back," he said quietly. Sandra let out a deep breath she didn't know she was holding. Ethan wiped his tears and whispered, "I told you, he always keeps his promise." Hours later, after the doctors left, Sandra sat beside Keanu again. He was weak, pale, but alive. The light from the window touched his face gently, like the world itself was relieved. She brushed his hair back and said softly, "You scared us." He smiled faintly. "Guess I needed to remind everyone I'm still stubborn." Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, holding another paper plane he had folded while waiting. "You said we can always fly again?" he whispered. Keanu looked at him with warmth and nodded slowly. "Yes, we can, Ethan. Even when we fall." There was silence for a moment, peaceful and fragile. Sandra wanted to keep it that way, but a thought still haunted her. "Keanu," she said carefully, "why didn't you tell anyone about Ethan?" "Not even me?" He looked away, his eyes deep and distant. Because kindness loses its meaning when it becomes public, he said. I didn't want the world to see it as a headline. I wanted him to live freely, not as someone's story. Sandra understood now. His silence wasn't guilt, it was humility. He didn't save Ethan for praise, he did it because that's who he was. Still, she could feel something deeper behind his words. But the letter? She asked softly. You wrote thank you, not goodbye. What did you mean? Keanu's eyes softened. I wrote it the night before my accident. I was planning to visit Ethan and tell him I was proud of him. I wanted to thank you because you were the one who told me to stop hiding from people. That night, I finally decided to live again. Sandra's throat tightened. She remembered that conversation. They had been at a small cafe, laughing about nothing. She had told him that the world needed more hearts like his. She never realized those words would mean so much. As they spoke, Ethan walked to the window, pointing outside. Look, he said. The rain stopped. The city glowed under the soft golden light, and for the first time, Sandra felt peace return. But just as she smiled, the door opened. Keanu's manager entered, looking uneasy. He handed a folder to Sandra. I didn't want to bring this now, he said. But the police found something near the crash site. Sandra frowned, opening the folder. Inside were photos of Keanu's wrecked motorcycle and a note taped to the handlebar. She froze. It was written in shaky handwriting. To whoever finds me, please return this to the boy at Rosehill. Under it was a name. Ethan Reeves. Ethan stared at the note, confused. Reeves? He whispered. Keanu's face went pale. Sandra looked between them, her voice trembling. Keanu, what does this mean? He closed his eyes slowly, pain crossing his face. Because he isn't just a boy I saved, he said quietly. He's my son! The room fell silent. Even the machine seemed to pause. Sandra's breath caught as Ethan's eyes widened. What? He whispered. Keanu looked at him, tears filling his eyes. I didn't know until a year after the accident. His mother, she was someone I cared for, long before Hollywood. We lost touch. I didn't know she had a child. When I found out, I couldn't tell anyone. I thought it was too late. Ethan stood frozen, the paper plane trembling in his hand. You mean, you're my dad? Keanu nodded slowly. Yes. I wanted to tell you that night. But fate had other plans. Sandra covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the moment. Keanu reached for Ethan's hand. I wasn't there when you needed me the most, he said softly. But if you'll let me, I want to be there now. Tears rolled down Ethan's cheeks as he whispered, I waited for you. I always knew you'd come. Keanu pulled him close, his arms trembling as he hugged the boy tightly. Sandra turned away, wiping her tears, watching the man who had spent years giving love in silence finally receive it back. But deep down, she sensed this story wasn't over. Something about the accident still felt wrong. Too sudden, too quiet, too planned. And as she looked at the police photos again, one small detail caught her eye. On the broken fence near the crash site, there was a strange mark. A burned pattern shaped like a symbol she had seen once before in an old photo from Keanu's past. Her heart began to race. Maybe the crash wasn't an accident after all. The shadow behind the crash the next morning came quietly, but Sandra couldn't shake the unease inside her. The symbol in the police photo wouldn't leave her mind. She had seen it before, carved faintly on the back of a letter Keanu once received years ago, a simple circle with 3 curved lines inside it. It wasn't just decoration, it was a mark. As Keanu slept peacefully, Sandra sat near the window, scrolling through her phone, searching old news articles. Finally, she found it. An old foundation Keanu had supported years ago, a charity that claimed to help orphaned children after car accidents. Its logo was the same symbol. But later, that organization was exposed for fraud. The founder had disappeared before facing trial. Her hands trembled as she whispered, No, it can't be. She looked at Keanu, still weak but resting. Had someone from that foundation come back? Was his accident connected to them? She didn't want to worry him. Not now. Not when Ethan had just found his father again. So she kept quiet. For the moment. By noon, Keanu was sitting up, talking softly to Ethan about his recovery. He looked tired but peaceful. Sandra smiled, trying to hide her thoughts. You two look perfect together, she said. Keanu smiled faintly. I guess life has strange ways of fixing what it breaks. Ethan giggled and handed him another folded paper plane. This one is for the future, he said proudly. It flies better than the last one. Keanu laughed softly, and for a brief moment, everything felt right again. But peace never stays long. That evening, while Sandra was heading out to get coffee, she noticed a man standing across the hospital parking lot. He was watching her closely, wearing a black cap and sunglasses. She froze for a second, her instincts screaming. When she looked again, he was gone. Later, back in Keanu's room, she tried to brush it off, but her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It said only one line, "Stop digging, or someone else will crash next." Her heart pounded. She deleted the message immediately, pretending nothing happened. But that night, she couldn't sleep. She knew she had to tell Keanu the truth. The next morning, Keanu was stronger. He was able to sit up without help. She decided to talk. Keanu, she began carefully, I think your accident wasn't random. His face stiffened. What do you mean? She handed him her phone, showing the photo of the burned symbol. This mark was on the fence. It's the same symbol from that charity, the one that collapsed years ago. Keanu's eyes widened slightly. I remember, he whispered. I helped fund it. But when I discovered they were exploiting the donations, I pulled out and spoke against them. A few of them blamed me for exposing the truth. They said I ruined their lives. Sandra took a deep breath. Then maybe they wanted revenge. Keanu stayed silent, his fingers tightening around the blanket. If that's true, he said quietly, they didn't just want to hurt me. They wanted to erase what I stood for. Ethan looked confused. Dad, what's happening? Keanu smiled softly and pulled him close. Nothing, buddy. Everything's okay. But his eyes told a different story. Later that afternoon, while Keanu rested, Sandra stepped outside to clear her mind. The hospital corridor was quiet, too quiet. Then she saw a nurse she didn't recognize enter Keanu's room with a tray. Something about her felt off. Sandra followed her quietly. When she entered the room, Keanu was already looking uneasy. The nurse was adjusting his IV line, but her hands were shaking. Sandra's voice was firm. What are you doing? The nurse froze. Keanu's eyes narrowed. I've never seen you here before, he said weakly. The nurse suddenly turned and bolted toward the door. Sandra rushed after her, shouting for security. 2 guards caught her near the elevator. Inside her pocket, they found a small vial labeled sodium thiopental. The doctor later confirmed. It was a sedative that in large doses could stop the heart quietly. Sandra felt cold all over. Keanu sat in shock, holding Ethan close as the police arrived to question the nurse. She refused to speak, only whispering the same words again and again. It's not over. After they took her away, Sandra sat beside Keanu, her eyes red. Someone really wanted you gone, she said softly. This wasn't an accident. Keanu nodded slowly. I should have known my past would catch up. He looked at Ethan and then back at her. I don't care about myself anymore, but I can't let anything happen to him. Not again. Sandra placed her hand on his. Then we'll protect him together. That night, as rain fell again, Keanu couldn't sleep. He looked out the window, lost in thought. Sandra, he said quietly, maybe I was never meant to survive that crash. Maybe someone saved me for a reason. She turned to him, confused. What do you mean? He looked at her with calm determination. I think whoever did this isn't finished yet. And if they come back, I need to face them. Sandra's voice trembled. Keanu, you're not strong enough for that. He smiled faintly. I don't need strength. I just need truth. As lightning flashed outside, his shadow stretched long across the wall. Sandra realized the man she once saw as quiet and gentle now carried the fire of someone ready to face his past. And somewhere, deep in the city's dark corners, another shadow watched the news of his survival and smiled. The game wasn't over yet. The last redemption, the next morning. Sunlight broke through the rain clouds, painting the hospital walls in soft gold. The night's fear still lingered, but for Sandra, It felt like calm before a final storm. Keanu sat quietly, staring out the window, his hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. Both looked peaceful, yet behind that peace was an unspoken awareness. This wasn't over. Sandra had spent the entire night talking with the police. They had discovered that the nurse was hired under a fake identity. Her records led to a small warehouse outside Los Angeles, registered under the same name as the old fraudulent foundation Keanu had exposed years ago. When Sandra told Keanu, his jaw tightened. "Then that's where it ends," he said quietly. He tried to stand, wincing slightly from his injuries. Sandra rushed to his side. "You can't go," she said firmly. "You just recovered." Keanu looked at her, his eyes calm but resolute. "They won't stop until I end it myself. I need to see who's behind this." Ethan looked frightened. "Dad, please don't go." Keanu knelt, placing his hand on his son's cheek. "Sometimes being brave means finishing what you started, but I promise, I'll come back." Sandra could see he had made up his mind. She sighed and grabbed her coat. "Then I'm coming with you. If this is the end, we face it together." The road to the warehouse was long and silent. The sky had turned gray again, clouds gathering above like an unfinished story. When they arrived, the place looked abandoned. Broken glass covered the floor, and old posters with the charity's logo hung torn on the walls. Keanu stepped forward slowly. "I used to believe this was a place of hope," he said softly. "I never imagined it would turn into this." A voice echoed from the shadows. "Hope doesn't feed greed, Mr. Reeves, but money does." A man emerged from the darkness, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in black. Sandra recognized him from old news photos. He was the missing founder of the charity, Daniel Hayes. His smile was cold. "You destroyed my life when you exposed us. You think you're some kind of saint, but you're just another actor pretending to care." Keanu stayed calm. "You stole from the helpless." "I only told the truth." Daniel's eyes darkened. "And for that, I lost everything. I spent years watching you live peacefully while I hid like a ghost. So I decided, if I couldn't live free, neither would you." Sandra stepped closer, her voice steady. "You tried to kill him. Even after all these years, you're still blaming others for your sins." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Sins? No, survival. The world forgets men like me, but it worships people like him. I wanted justice." Keanu shook his head. "Justice isn't revenge. It's what comes after forgiveness." The room fell silent. Even Daniel seemed caught off guard by his calm. Keanu continued softly. "You think destroying me will fix your pain, but it won't. It'll just make you empty again. I forgave you long before you came for me." For a moment, the man's expression cracked, but then his anger returned. "You don't get to forgive me," he hissed, pulling a gun from his coat. "You don't get to decide who suffers." Sandra gasped and stepped in front of Keanu instinctively. "Stop!" she shouted. "This won't bring your life back." Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder and stepped forward slowly. "If taking my life gives you peace, then do it. But leave them out of this." His voice was calm, almost serene. The rain outside began again, tapping softly against the broken windows. Daniel's hand trembled as he aimed the gun. The silence stretched long enough for Sandra's heart to break. Then, a small voice came from behind them. "Please don't hurt my dad." Ethan stood in the doorway, soaked in rain, his small hands shaking. He looked at Daniel with innocent eyes. "He saved me when no one else did. He didn't run away even when he was scared. You can be like that too." The words hit harder than bullets. Daniel's eyes flickered and his hand began to lower. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Why would you forgive someone like me?" Ethan took a small step forward. "Because my dad says forgiveness is what makes us human." The gun fell to the floor. Daniel sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands. The police arrived moments later, led by officers who had followed Sandra's earlier tip. They arrested Daniel quietly. He didn't resist. As the sirens faded, Keanu knelt and hugged Ethan tightly. "You saved me," he whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "No, Dad. You saved yourself." Days later, Keanu was finally discharged from the hospital. His body was weak, but his heart felt lighter than ever. He walked out into the sunlight with Sandra and Ethan beside him. Cameras flashed in the distance, but he didn't care. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Reeves, do you have anything to say after everything that happened?" Keanu looked at them, then smiled gently. "Only this," he said. "Kindness isn't weakness. Forgiveness isn't surrender. Both are strength, and both can change lives." As they walked toward the car, Sandra glanced at him and smiled. "So what now?" she asked. Keanu looked at Ethan, who was busy throwing his paper plane into the air. The plane caught the wind and soared high, circling once before landing softly near their feet. Keanu picked it up, unfolded it, and saw something written inside in Ethan's handwriting. "We can always fly again." He smiled, eyes glistening with quiet pride. "Now," he said softly, "we live." The wind carried the paper plane upward once more, disappearing into the golden sky.